Okay, gentlemen. Erev Shabbat Shalom, Umeborach, Parashat Beshalach. Obviously, the climax of Parashat HaShavua, and no doubt one of the greatest nisim ever performed on our behalf, is the Nes of Kiryat Yamsuf. So, B'ezrat Hashem, with your permission tonight, I want to share with you a new way of understanding this Nes, this miracle. And again, we'll get another glimpse of how HaKadosh Baruch Hu, He runs the world. Our journey begins on source number 1, which is the Gemara Shabbat. The Gemara Shabbat, it tells us a very strange miracle that took place in the times of the Talmud. The Gemara says, Tan Rabbanan, our rabbis taught us in the Braita, Rome, we just started. Tan Rabbanan, Ma'aseh be'ehad shemeta ishto. It was a case where Bar Minan, somebody, he lost his wife. V'inicha ben linanek, and she left him a son to nurse. However, but unfortunately this man was very poor and he didn't have enough money to pay a wet nurse to feed his son. So what happened? Miracle of miracles, the Gemara says. A miracle happened. Lo dadim. Kishnei dadei ha'isha ve'iniget beno. Okay, to keep this kosher, bottom line is that Hashem changed the biology for this man and he grew. He grew the anatomy of a woman, and he himself was able to breastfeed his son. That's what the Gemara says. No hiding over here. Mifurush Gemara and Daf Nun Gimel. So we have two opinions amongst the rabbis of this story. Is this a good story? Is this a bad story? First opinion says, Amar Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef says, Bo'ur'eh, come and see. Kama gadol adam zeh. How great is this man? Shna'asa lo nes kazeh. That an unbelievable miracle happened on his behalf. That is the opinion of Rabbi Yosef. Abaye didn't like this miracle. Amar le Abaye adraba. The opposite. Kama garua adam zeh. How bad is this person? Shnishtanu lo sidrei bereshit. That God changed the laws of nature to fit this man. So before we take this Gemara in the direction that I want to take it, I cannot deprive you from the Ben Ish Hai. The Ben Ish Hai, in his commentary to Shas called the Ben Yoyada, he comes along and he has a fascinating way to look at this piece. That's the second paragraph in source number 2. The Ben Ish Hai is fumbling with the question, why does God have to perform such a out-of-whack type of miracle? Why can't just Hashem make it derech hateva? Again, this guy you have two choices in front of you, Roman. A, God gives you enough money to pay a wet nurse. He doesn't have to change the laws of nature. Or option B was to change nature completely. Why not Hashem just take the easy way out, so to speak, and give this guy some money so he can pay a wet nurse? That's the Ben Ish Hai's question. I want to tell you what he says outside first. He says that God wanted to show how special this tzaddik was. He wanted to show that this man, that this miracle happened on his behalf, he was a very important man. And by just giving him money, it's not necessarily that this man is something special. I'll tell you why, says the Ben Ish Hai. Ben Ish Hai writes that sometimes if you have it, and again, he's giving you a glimpse on how God runs the world. Sometimes he writes that when somebody righteous needs something, Benjamin, are you listening? When somebody righteous needs something, and he's praying for something a lot, and there's other people in his neighborhood that need the same exact thing, sometimes what God will do is He's going to answer the righteous person, and because He answered the righteous person, other people will piggyback off him. So let's say you have a guy, very big tzaddik, he's praying for parnasah, praying parnasah, parnasah, parnasah. Turns out that 20 other families in his neighborhood also need parnasah. The way that God will do it is, the tzaddik will pray, God will answer the tzaddik, and therefore, and as a result, derech agav, all the other people will get answered as well. So therefore, if God would have just given this man enough money for he could feed his son and pay a wet nurse to do it, it's lav dafka, it's not specific that this man is righteous, because maybe I'll say there's another righteous man in the neighborhood that also needs parnasah. That man was righteous, that man prayed, and because he prayed, piggyback, this guy that needed to feed his child also got parnasah. See where I'm going with so far? So therefore, you have a benefit in a certain way that if you have a tzaddik living in a neighborhood, you never know. Maybe he's going to get answered because of him. You also got answered. However, God said, I want to make it known that this man is super special. Therefore, I'm not going to do it in the regular way. Rather, I'm going to create a miracle in itself so everybody knows this guy is very special to me. Clear so far? Says the Ben Ish Chai in source number 2, Digdek lomar kazeh. Look back at Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef said, Bo ur'eh kama gadol adam zeh. How great is this man? Says the Ben Ish Chai. She'im haya hakadosh baruch hu mamtzi lo ma'ot she'iten tzachah minikat. If God would have just given him enough money to pay the wet nurse, afa pi she'tiyeh hamtza'at ha'ma'ot benes. Even though this guy would have came upon money, would have been a miracle. However, lo haya muvrash nasa hanes bizchuto v'ra'ui hu lekach. It wouldn't have been guaranteed or so obvious that the nes was done on his behalf. Ela efshar. שהוא יתפלל שייתן לו הקדוש ברוך הוא רווח שיוכל ליתן ממונו שכר מניקת. God would have given him enough money to pay the wet nurse. ונזדמן, it could be possibly שאותה שעה התפלל צדיק אחד על דוחק עצמו. Maybe there was another man in his neighborhood also praying on his own behalf. שייתן לו הקדוש ברוך הוא רווח מעות, and he also needs money. And that guy that prayed, that somebody else that prayed, it was befitting for him to get answered. Says Ben Ish Chai, ואז תפילתו של זה נתחברה עם תפילת אותו צדיק ונענה עמו. What happens? The tefillah of the guy that doesn't deserve it gets connected with the tefillah of the guy that does deserve it, and everybody gets answered. כמו שאמרו רבותינו ז"ל, כשנפקדה רבקה בתפילתו של יצחק אבינו, נפקדו כמה עקרות עמה. What happened? Proof from the Torah, when Yitzhak and Rivka needed to get pregnant. They prayed for over 20 years. Esav and Yaakov was the result. So what happens? There was many women in the neighborhood that also needed to get answered to become pregnant. So what happens? After Rivka got answered because of the tefillah of her husband Yitzchak, who piggybacked off her? A lot of people in the neighborhood that also needed to get pregnant, they piggybacked off the tefillah of Yitzchak. So therefore, there is such a concept where people could just grab on, they can latch onto the prayer of a tzaddik and get answered as well. Once God opens up the pipe of abundance, once he opened up for Yitzchak, everybody else got opened up also. וכן כאן, יש לומר הכי, ואין מזה הוכחה על גודל צדקתו. Therefore, if this tzaddik that would have prayed, listen, Hashem, I need some money to give my son, to hire a wet nurse for my son, it's not a guarantee that he got answered because of his righteousness. Maybe there was somebody else who's more righteous that prayed. God is answering that guy. And just as a piggyback, this other guy's getting answered also. Therefore says the Ben Ish Chai, Hashem didn't want this case for this man. Ella says the Ben Ish Chai as follows. He says, unbelievable. כיוון שראינו שהשם יתברך עשה לו נס בזה שהוא דבר שאין מצוי בני אדם. God made a miracle for this man, something that you don't find by people. לא משכחת לה שיש אדם בעולם שיבקש ויתפלל לפני הקדוש ברוך הוא דבר כזה להיות מניק מדדיו כאישה. No guy will ever pray, Hashem, please, let me grow the biology of a woman so I can feed my son. No one is asking for that prayer. Therefore it says the Ben Ish Chai, that's why God made it this way, so it's a guarantee. It's the biggest hochacha. It's the biggest proof that God made a miracle on behalf of this man. Therefore says the Ben Ish Chai, because im ken vadai nes kaze lo naaseh ela bishvilo. I'm guaranteed that this nes was made for this man. V'lekel lemeimash niftach shar shel nes ze letzadik acher umemele niftach lazen. There's no way you could say maybe another righteous man got answered. And this guy is just, he's just latching on. He's a scavenger. He's scavenging on this guy. There's no way you could say it. So that is the first interpretation of the Ben Ish Chai, how he explains this piece. Abba says the Ben Ish Chai, Abaye Amar, but the second opinion in the Talmud, where Abaye said, no, this guy is horrible, that's no good. Why did he say that? Kama garua adam zeh. How bad is this guy? Shinishhtanu lo sidrei bereshit. That God had to change nature for him. Says Ben Ish Chai, lo daike. Shaya shinoi bigufo liot meni kemo isha. He had a change in his body. Now he could breastfeed like a woman. V'ika bazet tarte. There is two negatives. by this guy now becoming a half of a woman. Why is it two negatives, says the Ben Ish Chai? First of all, his body changed. He went from a man to go to a woman. I'm not sure how positive that is. Maybe nowadays it's positive. But back in the day, it definitely was not something special. No, even today? No. Today people. No, people. Not only that, but by this guy changing his body, it doesn't benefit anybody else. Because if he would have prayed, Hashem, please give me money, maybe because of him, many other people would have benefited as well. But the fact that he prayed that his body should change, God is only changing his body, nobody else's body. And therefore, it's kind of like a selfish miracle where only happens to him and nobody else. Therefore, it says the Ben Ish Chai, now the Ben Ish Chai throws you a curveball. Now the Ben Ish Chai throws you a curveball. And for this curveball, you need a small introduction. Says the Ben Ish Chai, that one time, we know, it's well known in history, that the Nasi of Klal Yisrael, there are obviously many Nisi, many presidents of Klal Yisrael, but the most well-known Nasi of Am Yisrael was Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi shared, Rabbini HaKadosh, he shared a very, very special relationship with one of the biggest goyim of his time. Who was that gentleman? Antoninus, the emperor. In English, they call him Marcus Aurelius. So Marcus Aurelius was Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's best friend. In fact, the Gemara tells fascinating stories on how they used to meet in private all the time. The emperor used to build a underground tunnel from Rome all the way to Jerusalem. I don't know what that involves. The logistics of that is probably a mess. But he built a special tunnel every single day. He used to come and learn with Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. And the Gemara is asking, why? What happened? What happened to this relationship between these two great giants, Rabbi, the Nasi of Klal Yisrael, and Antoninus, the emperor of Rome? Why did they share such a special relationship? Why did Antoninus care so much about the Jews? And Tosfot in Masechet Avodah Zarah tells us a fascinating story. That one time it was, when there was a gezerah, there was a decree, and the Roman emperor said that nobody could give a Brit Milah to their children. That was the law. This was Antoninus' father. So his father made a decree, nobody could give Brit Milah to their children. And obviously Rabbi's father, who was Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, like we learned this morning in Moed Katan, he got up and he gave his son a Brit Milah. And someone told on him, he was ratted out. And they took Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and his wife over to the emperor, to the palace of Rome, in order to give him the death penalty. And she's coming in with her little child, Rabbi, holding Rabbi, the boy that has the brit. And apparently, the empress, which is Antoninus' mother, she actually had a relationship with the mother of Rabbi. So when she saw the mother of Rabbi inside the palace, she said, "What are you doing here?" She said, "Well, I gave my son a brit, and your husband said it's forbidden, so we're going to have a court case now." And she says, "That's not a problem. I also had a baby boy. We called him Antoninus, and obviously I didn't give my son a brit. How about this? How about we switch children temporarily? You give me Rabbi, I'll give you Antoninus. And when you present the child in front of my husband, he's the emperor. He's too busy to know what my son looks like. And therefore, he's gonna examine him. He's gonna see that the boy doesn't have a brit. He doesn't know. He's looking at his own son. But he's saying, you know what? No brit. Go home. It was just a false testimony. That's a good idea. So in the interim, Rabbi's mother, she nursed Antoninus, and also Rabbi was nursed from this empress. So therefore, it says Tosfot, you want to know why Antoninus shared such a special relationship with the Jewish people? It's because since he drank tipot chalav, he drank pure milk, kosher milk from a righteous lady, that's why his mind opened up in ways that we cannot imagine. Therefore, the reason why he showed so much favoritism to the Jews is because when he was first born, what happened? He drank a few drops of kosher milk from his mother. Says Tosfot in source number 3, I'll get back to the Ben Ish Chai in a second. Tosfot, Besechet Avodah Zarah, Daf Yud, Kishenolad Rabbi. When Rabbi was born, Gazru Shelo Yimol. It was the gezerah that nobody has the Brit Milah. Ve'aviv ve'imo mal'uhu. They give a Brit Milah anyway. Shalach Kesar. So the Caesar sent, Ve'viu l'Rabbi ve'imo lefanav. he was brought in front of the castle of the king. And his mother switched him with Antoninus. She gave him food until they brought him in front of the Caesar. Once the emperor examined, and he was examining his own son without knowledge, he said, he doesn't have a Brit Milah, go home. Based on that story, the Ben Ish Chai says, back inside the Ben Ish Chai in source number 2, in the last paragraph, and he writes, Ubesefer Hadorot, in the Sefer Hadorot, Ot Yud Dalet, Katav B'Shem Sefer Gigulei Neshamot, Rama Mipano. He's a sefer that's written that everybody in history, who was the Gilgul Neshama of who? Special sefer, Gilgul Neshamot. Says the Rabbi, Ki Eshet HaMelech, שהניקה את רבי בזמן הגזרה להציל את רבי מהריגה. This woman, this empress that gave Rabbi to drink to save Rabbi from her husband, נתגלגלה באיש הזה. This man in the story that grew the dadim of a woman, he was the Gilgul Neshama of the empress of Antoninus' mother. In order to get her into Olam Haba. That's why the miracle happened to him where he was able to nurse like a woman, because in his previous life he was married, or she was married, to the emperor of Rome. And now now he's a poor man. In his first Gilgul, he was inside the Hechal of the Melech. Again, unbelievable shout to the Ben Ish Chai, definitely one for the archives. But go back to what we're talking about. That's just an introduction. That was just a. Can? Yeah, there's no. Can? But go back to Abaye's statement, gentlemen. What did Abaye say? Abaye didn't like the story. And he said, Kama garua adam ze. This guy is very negative. Very negative what happened to this man. Ben Ish Chai explained why, either because it's a selfish miracle, or now that he changed from a man to a woman. But the Maharsha has a different understanding. The Maharsha says, and this is the point of the class, he writes, we might think sometimes the miracles are good, and we love reading about miracle stories. But the Maharsha says, it's not necessarily where a miracle is super beneficial. Why? Because when a person has a miracle done to him, something happens. Exactly. The Gemara says, it cleans him from zuchuyot. It's able to take a lot of the zuchuyot that he has, all the merits, and some of the mitzvot that he's done, very special mitzvot, and God says, listen, you have two choices. I either make a miracle for you, and I take off a lot of zuchuyot, zotomet, miracles are very, very expensive, or I don't make a miracle for you, and you keep all your zuchuyot, you get paid one large sum in Olam Haba. Which one would you rather? So it's a hard choice to make, but miracles are indeed very, very expensive. So the fact that this guy in this story had his anatomy changed by turning into a woman, that is a miracle, a tremendous miracle. And who says that miracle is going to be free? Therefore, says the Maharasha, it's not the best to get things for free. Now, based on that tremendous introduction, now we have a story. Why? Because we'll go back to Parashat Beshalach, out of Parashat HaShavua. One of the biggest miracles happened to the Jewish people, and that is the splitting of the sea. Now, hold on a second. If miracles are expensive, who's going to pay for this miracle? Again, there's a law. And the rule is, when a person has a miracle, especially like this, that is probably the biggest miracle of history, these miracles are not free. So how did we do it in a way where we get a miracle, we receive a nes, who's going to pay for it? Zenachon. Again, I'm not coming to answer every single nes that happened, but according to the logic and to the principle that our rabbis laid down for us, that when there's a miracle, it costs money. Who pays for, or who paid for Kiryat Yamsuf? There's a sefer called Ohel Yaakov, and he gives an unbelievable answer. Title of the class, gentlemen. Title of the class is the offset. What does offset mean, Roman? That sometimes when nature is changed, God will make sure that the miracle is offset by something else in order to balance everything out. As an example, you have a tremendous miracle on one side, now the scale is tipped like this. What God will do is, He'll cause something else to happen over here for everything to go back into balance. And He gives an example. He gives actually 3 examples, Ohel Yaakov. And he writes, if you look at source number 4, with Yaakov Avinu, it says, if you remember, when Yaakov was traveling, it says that he got to the place of the Makom Mikdash. And what happened? In that place, what happened? He fell asleep. When he fell asleep, he had the famous dream of Yaakov in the ladder. The Torah tells us, the truth is that there was a lot more time during the day when Yaakov reached that spot. But God wanted him to fall asleep faster so he could have the dream as soon as possible. So what did God do? God made a miracle at that point, and he caused the sun to set early. Look at the source number 4, and it says, Perek Chavchet Pasuk Yud Aleph, Vayivga b'makom. He reached the place. Vayal and Sham. He rested over there. Ki ba hashemish. The reason why he rested at this spot at this time, ki ba hashemish, because God caused it, a miracle, where the sun was setting early. Says Ohel Yaakov, because God made a miracle and the sun set at this point early, there's got to be an offset. God has to make sure that he offsets this miracle. Therefore, we're going to find it again in history. If the sun set early via a miracle, it's got to rise early via a miracle also to offset the original miracle. Do we have it in history where the sun did rise early for Yaakov Avinu's sake? Absolutely. Right after he fought with the angel, he gave him the shot Bekaf Erecho in his Gira Nasheh. In order to heal Yaakov, God wanted to bring the sun out as early as he could because the sun has healing capability. And therefore, even though it wasn't the time of sunrise yet, Pasuk says in the very next Pasuk, Lamed Bet, Vayizrach lo Hashemish. The sun shone on his behalf. And the rabbis tell us this happened early just in order to heal Yaakov a little more time before this. So therefore, that miracle of rising and setting was done on purpose. One was the miracle, the other one was to offset. Clear, gentlemen, so far? Everything is clear what I'm telling you? He gives another example with the makot, with the plagues. The fact that the Aaron stick turned into a snake, why didn't God just have it where it just stayed a snake? Elamai, he had to turn it back into a snake because that was the offset. It was the turning into a snake that was the miracle. Then the offset of the miracle was turning it back into a stick. The other example he gives is by Sarah Imenu. When Sarah was kidnapped by Avimelech, the miracle that God made was that what? That everybody in the house of Avimelech was closed. All the orifices, nobody was able to go to the bathroom. Nobody was able to give birth. That was a miracle. What was the offset of that miracle? Anybody know? Where something became opened, she became pregnant and she gave birth. Therefore, the offset of the miracle that God made by closing the house of Avimelech was, the offset was Sarah giving birth. Are we good so far? Now that's the principle that he lays down. The concept of that's called offset. Now let's go back to Yam Suf. Let's talk about Yam Suf for a second. How are we going to pay for Yam Suf? It's very expensive. Says Ohel Yaakov, unbelievable. He says that Yam Suf wasn't the original miracle. Yam Suf was the offset. Yam Suf was the offset. Can we think about when in history did we have it where a body of water was placed somewhere where it did not belong? So God has to make an offset miracle that God has to remove a body of water where it belongs. Gentlemen, I give you Midrash Tanhumat on source number 5. Abraham Avinu is traveling with his son, Yitzhak, for the Akedah. And at first, Satan doesn't want him to do it, obviously, because this is a tremendous zechut. We're still eating from the Akedah right now. And Midrash goes through a whole story, how the Satan was trying to appear to Abraham Avinu just to stop him. He appeared as an old man. He tried to convince him nothing was working. And all of a sudden it says, Vahi b'yom hashlishi. It was on the third day. And the Midrash is puzzled. On the third day? But wherever Abraham Avinu lived, the walk to Hara Moriah, which is Mount Moriah, it's very, very short. Why did it take him 3 days to walk there? Says Midrash, source number 5, Midrash Tanchuma, b'yom hashlishi. Says Midrash, V'chei mahar shederech kerova, lama nit'akev shloshat yamim. It's a very close walk. Why did it take Abraham Avinu 3 days to get there? Says Midrash, once the Satan saw that Abraham Avinu was not buying what he was selling, he made a tremendous river in front of him. Miyad yarad Abraham letoch hamayim. So Abraham Avinu went straight into the water. Higiu ad birkav. It got to his legs. He told his people, come with me. Yardu Harab, they ran after him. They got to the half of the river. Higiu Hamaim ad Savaro. The water got up to where? His chinny chin chin, all the way up to his chin. And what happens? At that time, Abraham looks towards the sky. You revealed yourself to me, you chose me, and you told me, I am one, and you are one. Through you, I'm going to make my name known. You're going to take your son and put it on the Mizbeach. And I did not refuse. I am involving myself in your commandment. And now, Ba'u Ma'im Ad Nafesh. Pasuk in Tehillim, that the Ma'im has come all the way to my soul. It has reached my spirit. If my son or I, we drown, who's going to fulfill your words? Who's going to make a Kiddush Hashem? God tells Abraham, it's going to be through you that's going to make a tremendous Kiddush Hashem. Mi'ad, immediately, Ga'ar HaKadosh Baruch Hu et ha'ma'ayan vayivash ha'na'ar va'amdu bayabasha. Right away, God rebuked the Satan, and the water disappeared, and Abraham is standing on dry land. The Rabotai says, Ohel Yaakov, this was the first miracle. The first miracle of God turning dry land into water. Now he must turn water into dry land. And therefore, the question that we ask based on the Maharsha, how could it be that such a miracle happens? Who's going to pay for this miracle? The answer is, on the offset, when the miracle is offsetted, the miracle is for free because it was already paid back. Therefore, to answer the question, who's going to pay for Kiryat Yamsuf? The answer is, didn't have to be paid for. God, in His infinite wisdom, He arranged it where automatically, when the Satan tried to stop Avraham Avinu, so it turns out, Rabbi, in retrospect, who is kind of responsible for Kiryat Yamsuf? Or Avraham Avinu, I would say. It's his credit. That's why I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised at the Midrash Rabbi that I found. Source number 6. The Midrash says, B'schar shtei bikiot shebaka Avraham Avinu otze'olah. Because Avraham Avinu, he chopped the wood. He chopped the wood in order to sacrifice his son, says the Midrash, libaka hayam. Because he chopped the wood, because he split the wood, what happened? The sea split. Turns out that the Midrash actually gives credit to who? To Abraham for splitting the sea. Very similar language. Abraham split the wood, therefore the sea was split on his behalf. Turns out it's very, very intimately connected. Because the reason why it was split was because it was in order to offset that miracle. Everybody's holding so far? Now watch. I want to take this one step further and then we're finished. You know, there's a minhag, and it's a very good minhag, to read Adon Olam in Shaharit time. Right after Birkot HaShachar, it's a very good item, it's a big segula, read Adon Olam. Anybody think of a reason why we read Adon Olam right by Shaharit time? Take a wild guess why Adon Olam specifically? The Gemara Barachot says, which is source number 7, that Avraham Avinu was the first person ever to call God Adon. So therefore, as a remembrance, or as a commemoration of the fact that Abraham called God Adon, and who established Tefillat Shaharit? Avraham Avinu. Therefore, in Shaharit we read Adon Olam. Good so far? Says the Gemara Barachot, Daf Zayin, Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Miyom Shebara HaKadosh Baruch Hu et HaOlam, from the moment God created the world, Lo Haya Adam Shekar'o LaKadosh Baruch Hu Adon. Nobody ever called God Master. Ad Sheba Abraham Ukar'o Adon, until Abraham called him Adon. Therefore we sing Adon Olam in the mornings to commemorate Avraham Avinu, who established Tefillat Shaharit. Now watch, Abutai. Turns out from here, the two examples that the Ohel Yaakov uses to tell us this genius way the way that God runs the world of offset is two people. It's who? It's Yaakov, from the story of sun setting and sun rising, to the story of Abraham from the Akedat Yitzhak, which eventually led to Kriyat Yamsuf. Turns out it's who? It's Yaakov and it's Abraham. So beautiful, Rabutai, is King David in Tehillim. When David HaMelech talks about the splitting of the sea, look at source number 8, Tehillim, Perek Kuf, Yud Daled. The way he learns it is rhetorically. He says, Ma lecha hayom kitanus. What does that mean? Ma lecha hayom kitanus. What does that mean? What do you have, see, that you split? What David Melech is asking, he's asking a question. See, why did you split? What's bad about splitting of the sea, everybody? What's bad about splitting of the sea? It takes away your zuchuyot. So, ma lecha hayam kitanus. Why are you splitting? It's taking away from our zuchuyot. What's the very next pasuk? What does it say? Min lifnei Adon chulei aretz, min lifnei Eloha Yaakov. It's specifically mentioning Adon and Yaakov. Who's Adon? Adon is Abraham Avinu, who called God Adon. So therefore, it's miduyak in the pasuk. The fact the pasuk is telling me, no, it's not considered a bad thing that the sea split, because the whole thing is offset. And how do I know about offset? Min lifnei Adon chulei aretz, min lifnei Eloha Yaakov. Because I learned it out from Adon, and I learned it out from Yaakov Avinu. These two people, they experience the offset in their life. Therefore, Kriyat Yamsuf is considered a free miracle. I thought this was an unbelievable Peshat, a great way of how to understand, a new way of understanding how the Akedah and how Kriyat Yamsuf, how it actually works behind the scenes. Because it's not so simple to have a miracle performed on your behalf. Because sometimes when you have a miracle performed, these miracles are expensive. But now that I have this new concept called the offset, now everything kind of and slowly falls into place. Maybe we'll end with one short idea from the Sar Shalomi Bells, the Bells of Rabbi. He says, it's a well-known midrash, and Rashi brings it down, that when God split the sea, it wasn't only the Yam that split. It wasn't only the Maim that split. Rather, it was every single body of water in the world that split. If a guy was drinking a cup of coffee, at the time the sea split, his coffee also split. If a guy's taking a bath in a jacuzzi, his jacuzzi also split. Every single body of water split. It's a Rashi on the place. And the question the Belzer Rebbe asks is, why? Why do such a miracle? God never does miracles stam. No such thing as a stam miracle. Therefore, why would it be? I understand the miracle of splitting of the sea because they needed to get through. But why is God splitting my cup of coffee? Why is God splitting my jacuzzi? What's Peshat? Why is God splitting every single body of water? You know what he answers? He answers that the word mayim can mean water, but mayim can also mean hardship. What's his proof? His proof from the Midrash that we just brought. What did Avraham Avinu say when the water came up to his chin? What do you say? Higiu mayim or ba'u mayim ad nafesh. Pasuk in Tehillim. Hoshi'enu elukim. God saved me. Ki ba'u mayim ad nafesh. Because mayim has come up to my nefesh. The mayim in this case could also mean tzarot. That all the negativity, all my troubles, they have reached over here. So the word mayim could also mean hardship. Therefore, the fact that God split every single water in the world was in order to tell us that mayim can mean water, but mayim can also mean troubles. That just like God split the sea and put an end to the troubles of Klal Yisrael, Shabbat Shirah, which is this week, it has a tremendous segula of prayer to save people, not only from physical waters, but from the waters that are called tzarot, higiu mayim ad nafesh. Those waters that give hardship and difficulty for everybody else in their life. Shabbat Shirah is a special time where God says, I hereby split those waters of trouble, those waters of hardship and tsar. He writes, the Gemara says, the Gemara compares three things to Kiryat Yamsuf. Gemara Sotah. Anybody know those three things the Gemara compares to? Three things. What's compared to Kiryat Yamsuf? The Gemara says, Shidduchim, Parnasah, and childbirth. That's why he says there's a special segula on this Shabbat. Some people have the minhag to finish all Sefer Tehillim on Shabbat Shirah. And they have in mind specifically Parnasah, Shidduchim, and childbirth. These things, because it's a special segula on this time, because since the Gemara compares the splitting of the sea to these three things, Dafka, special segula. Not only does God split the physical waters, but also the miracles, the waters of Hiyu Mayim Ad Nafesh, those tzarot, God also has the ability to split. I'll finish one last story. I read to my kids this afternoon. Remember I told you about Rabbi Tzion Kalatsko, the famous rabbi, Shabbat.com. The rabbi lives in Monsey, Kirov rabbi. He has over 100 guests every single week. He tells a fascinating story about Shidduchim. He says that part of his outreach is that he takes college kids to visit Israel during the summer. He said one day he was on one of these summer trips with his college kids, and he receives a phone call from a woman who introduced herself as Michelle. She says, "Hi, Rabbi Kalatsko, my name is Michelle." And she began telling her story a little bit, and right away Rabbi Kalatsko recognized who she was. Michelle was also a college student that Rabbi Kalatsko took on one of these trips, but many years ago, 23 years ago. Michelle came on this on this Kiruv Israel trip with Rabbi Kalatsko to Israel. She was a regular secular girl, but somehow Rabbi Kalatsko convinced her during that Israel trip to stay in the famous seminary called Neve Yerushalayim. My Rabbi, Rabbi Kelman, is a rabbi there for over 20 years. It's a great place in Har Nof. It literally took girls from all around the globe and made them great, religious, wholesome type of women. So this girl, Michelle, she went to Neve Yerushalayim, and from there it changed her entire life. And she decided to stay in Israel, and she married a very idealistic boy that, even though it was hard for her because her parents were very against her changing her life, but like all secular parents, you ask any secular parent, the most nachat they get is from that religious kid that they have. It's always like that. Whether it's the grandkids or the kids, the most nachat is always from the most religious. Anyway, so she met a idealistic boy, same type of hashkafot, same type of ideology, and she married him, and they moved to Israel, and it's been 23 years later, her husband still learns in Kollel, and she has 10 kids. And she heard that Rabbi Ben-Zion Kalatsko is visiting Israel, and for a long time she wanted him to meet her children because she credits him as the guy that changed her life. So she said, Rabbi Kalatsko, can I meet you somewhere? I want you to meet my family. He says, sure, I'll be in the kotel in an hour. So she drives over to the kotel, and he was like the grandfather. All the kids, the 4-year-old ran up to him and gave him a big hug, like he was the bobo, she was the Zaidi of the family. And like a nice grandfather, he took all the kids out to ice cream after that. Like I said, she had 10 kids, but one of the kids was missing. Her name was Adina. She was the oldest, and she was spending her summers here in New York. In fact, a couple of blocks away from here in Far Rockaway. She was a counselor in a camp, Far Rockaway. So right before they part ways, Rabbi Kalatsko tells Michelle, who by the way is not Michelle anymore, she's Michal. He says, listen, he goes, I host people by my house for Shabbat all the time. I'm sure you've heard. If your daughter is ever interested in coming for Shabbat, she has a place. 2 weeks later, he comes back to New York. He gets a phone call from this Adina, the daughter of Michal. And she says, my mother told me you invited me for Shabbat. Behavot, come over. And for the next 6 weeks, every single Shabbat, Adina is coming over to Rabbi Ben-Zion Kalatsko's house. And eventually, they formed a very, very close relationship. Ad kedei kach, so close, that when Adina got married, a couple of months later, she invited the entire Kalatsko family. Rabbi Ben-Zion, his wife, and all the kids, they flew into Israel for the wedding. Could you take a guess of why they flew into Israel for the wedding? Because Adina married Rabbi Ben-Zion Kalatsko's son, Gabriel. When after spending so many weeks at that house, they realized what kind of beautiful girl this Adina was. Not only beautiful physically, but also beautiful spiritually, midot-wise, character-wise. They said, this is the perfect match for our Gabriel. Turns out that 23 years earlier, that's when the Shidduch really began. 23 years earlier, when Rabbi Ben-Zion made the decision of trying to convince this girl to put her into Neve Yerushalayim, which eventually changed the whole trajectory of her life, turns out he was really making a shidduch for his own son. That's what it means that shidduchim is hard like Kriyat Yam Suf. It sounds like it's coming from left field. Who would have expected Yam Suf to split? They only had a couple of choices. We either go back to Egypt, we go left or right, we fight, but no one ever thought the sea would split out of left field. That's the way shidduchim come along. That's the way parnasah comes along. That's the way childbirth comes along. It's usually from left field, but just like the Tzami Bell said, this Shabbat is a special time, Shabbat Shirah, to pray for these things because it's a time of Sigulah. It's a time to miyahid. It's time to crown God as our king. And like we said, you might not think, or you might think that Kriyat Yam Suf is an expensive miracle, but God says, once I offset it, once I play around with here and there, then everything, for all the puzzle pieces, they fall into place. Okay, wishing our members a Shabbat Shalom. Rabbi